Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer, and my guest today is Neelam. I interviewed Neelam a couple of years ago, and you may want to listen to that interview before listening to this one, but otherwise just go ahead and listen to this one. It'll be fine on its own. Neelam is a direct disciple of H.W.L. Poonja, Papaji, whose teacher was Ramana Maharshi. Her unequivocal commitment to truth helps us turn inward and release underlying patterns of conditioning which block the recognition of our true nature. With the utmost tenderness, while helping us to address all aspects of daily living, including past conditioning and trauma, she invites us into the same recognition of truth that her teacher, Papaji, transmitted to her. And I can attest to that, having listened to about 13 hours worth of Neelam's recordings before this interview and about 20 hours before the previous one. There's a real sweet rapport between her and the people that she works with, and she works with small groups on phone conferences, and probably in other ways as well, but that's what, and extending over a period of months. So there's a sort of an ongoing course that people take and interact with Neelam, and there's a very sweet family feeling that develops among the participants and a lot of personal attention. So Neelam, welcome again. Thanks for doing this.
Welcome, thank you.
Yeah, and I'd like to start with a basic question, which is that the word awakening, or sometimes enlightenment, maybe we'll see if you distinguish between those two words, is used a lot. You hear so many people saying, I had an awakening. But unless we all agree on what that actually means, then we're not communicating when we use the word. You know, one person says one thing and 10 different people hear 10 other things. So I'd like to start this interview by having you define what you mean by awakening, and perhaps also enlightenment, if there's any distinction between the terms, and that'll provide a good foundation for the rest of our discussion.
Beautiful. So I really think it's a very important question, because, as you say, so many things can be called awakening, right? So, you know, I have to start, I have to go back, and I have to start with the direct experience of presence. Because that, first of all, that's the, you know, the very direct transmission of the natural state, right? It's also the gift of this lineage, you know, that this lineage just goes directly right there and says, here you are, that's your nature, and you can know that in this moment, right? So we have to begin with this, because without knowing this, you know, we can't talk about anything. It can't be just a mental understanding. It has to be an actual experience.
Right.
So once we have that, once we know that, and whenever that happened, right, it might have happened a long time ago, or years ago, or lifetimes ago, or, you know, there's this process that starts, which is really guided by our desire for freedom. And that's what I call the process that leads to awakening. And in this process, we will go through these experiences, many different times of experiences of expansion and, you know, kind of out of body, you know, and bliss and love and peace and oneness and consciousness and all sorts of different things we may experience. And yet eventually we are going to go back to identifying, or go back to that sense of identity as me, that little sense of identity, right? So it will be a great experience, and it will be like, you know, I'm back here. And that is going to go on and on and on for however long it goes. This is predetermined, we don't know, you know, but eventually we come to this moment where that shift happens. And the shift happens, and it's a change from that sense of identity that is based in the body, right? We habitually, even when we point to ourselves, we say, this is me. And then when we direct our attention inward, it lands first on the sense of the body, right? And that is the sense of identity. And in the moment of awakening, something happens, something shifts, something changes, and that sense of identity changes into knowing oneself as presence, right? And so now it's not a mental knowing, it's an actual direct knowing that in the moment when you bring your attention to your inner, where the attention lands is presence, right? It's nowhere, it's nothing, right?
Is it ever 100% one way or the other? You know, is there anybody in the world who is, you know, just 100% identified with presence and no sense of individuality, or anybody vice versa who is so completely locked into their individuality that there's just no remnant of presence whatsoever? Or is it always a matter of, you know, 50-50 or 40-60 or 30-70?
I don't know that this is the point, and I don't know that this is the point when we talk about awakening, right? Because when I talk about awakening, I'm talking about that shift of attention, right? A shift of attention, and there's no percentage in it, you know? There's no percentage. You either know yourself as this body or you know yourself as presence. There is no like 70% knowing yourself as presence. Now, however, awakening doesn't necessarily mean the end of conditioning, right?
Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean that once awakened, that means nothing ever arises and there's no stuff going on. That's not true, right? It means only that there really is the knowing, and the actual knowing that is not anymore, it's not anymore a question. It's also not anymore, see, before it was like, is this it? Wow, that was great. And then where is it? Right? And now that is not there anymore, right? There's a simple knowing that who we are is always here. It doesn't mean that that's the end of conditioning. It doesn't mean that that's the end of everything that arises, right?
So I heard you describing a period, I think you might have been with Mother Mira then, when you'd be in bliss for a period of days maybe, and then you'd be in hell for a period of days, and bliss and hell, and bliss and hell.
Throughout the same day, you know.
So, yeah. And you said, you know, eventually you got tired of that, and you felt you needed to find a teacher who could bring you out of that cycle, and you found Papaji, and that eventually happened. When it eventually did happen, was the awakening you experienced substantially unique and different from the bliss period that you experienced with Mother Mira? In other words, was it a whole different ball game? It wasn't just
different. And when you say I found Papaji, I would say Papaji found me, or Satsang found me, or you know, the response of the, you know, when the desire is true on the inner, the universe or consciousness responds to that, right? That's how we find the teacher, right? Or the teacher finds us, or however that works. So yes, completely different, because sitting in blissful states, there will be an end to it. And there will be a period when there wouldn't be any blissful states, right? So it will be coming in and out of it, right? It was like a samadhi state that was not yet the final samadhi, where there isn't any more the coming out of it, right? So there will be that blissful state, and then there will be suffering, right? And so, and now there's no coming out, you know, there's no coming out of knowing, right? There's no, it doesn't depend on the state, you see. It is not dependent on, is there bliss here, or is there pain here, or is there challenges here, or is there just, you know, blissful, loving states here? That doesn't matter, that doesn't touch it, see?
So now you would not say that you're in bliss all the time, but awakening is different than being in bliss all the time. That's what you're saying.
For sure, definitely.
Yeah. So you could be unhappy or angry or feeling sick or all kinds of, you know, things that we don't usually consider to be blissful, but those don't compromise the awakened state necessarily.
We can say all these states arise in presence, and there's always a challenge or a chance to identify with it. Right? That is still always the possibility, right? So there needs to be that real true vigilance, right, with that. However, that knowing of who I am, that's not something that comes and goes, right? That's not something that happens, you know, when there's everything is going well and then it unhappens, you know. That is not affected by whatever states arise here.
Yeah. And so by knowing who I am, you mean whatever states are coming and going, presence is like a continuum and is just not affected or diminished by those states.
Let's do it right now, Rick. Why can't I ask you to just direct your attention towards your inner? Can I ask?
Closing my eyes or just doing it?
You can do however you want. Close your eyes or open. It doesn't matter to me.
Okay, I'll close my eyes.
Yeah, just direct your attention towards the inner. Beautiful. Beautiful. And what do you know in this moment? What do you know?
Same presence as when my eyes are open and my attention is directed outwards, but with less sensory input.
Right. Of course. But the presence is not different, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter, like maybe now you're feeling whatever you're feeling because we are sitting and doing an interview, right? And maybe an hour from now you will be in a completely different state because something will be going on in your life, right?
Yeah.
Something different. And yet when you direct your attention towards this, is it any different?
No. And what I find is that you don't really need, maybe it made a difference in the early days, but after a while you don't really need to direct your attention to it any more than you need to direct your attention to breathing. And in fact, you know, thinking about it or trying to put your attention on it doesn't make it any more there than forgetting to think about it causes it to go away. It's sort of like a solid thing.
Exactly. And you know that I'm just reflecting back on what you said. Was there a difference between when I was, you know, sitting in bliss and suffering and then after the awakening? And I remember that the first time after that awakening experience, when I went back to Satsang with Papaji, and I walked into that Satsang, and I knew in this moment, you know, Papaji is me, everything is just here, right? And as before, it was, this is me, and this is Papaji, and this is the thing that is going on here, and these are the people, right?
Yeah.
And now everything is just me, right? Everything is just me, and that's just how it is, you know. There is no separation, right?
So after your awakening, then everything was in terms of the self, you could say.
Exactly.
And from then on, or was that just an initial taste, and then that kind of faded? And
from then on, what faded initially, there was this elation and blissful states connected with this experience, and that lasted maybe a couple of years, right? And that subsides too, but that knowing that everything is who we are, that's always here, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't change.
That's interesting because in my experience, I feel that presence is very strong, but I don't feel like I've totally gotten this thing of everything is me. You know, and I've discussed this with some other people I've interviewed also. When I look at the tree or I look at my computer or something, I don't sort of have that sense that I hear some people describing. So it makes me wonder, you know.
I hear you. And so just can we do one more time? Close your eyes, one. And when you have your eyes closed and you really direct your attention towards the inner, right? And when you hear my voice speaking right now, Rick, where is that voice coming from?
Well, it's just in my own consciousness.
It's here, right?
Yeah.
It's not coming from anywhere. Right? So just for a moment, give the moment of attention to what you just said. It's in your own consciousness.
Yeah, and so is the tree and the car and the... Yeah.
Everything really, truly is in your consciousness.
I see that, I understand that, but somehow I don't interpret that as seeing things as me. You know what I mean?
Because you're still thinking about it, you see? If you using your mind and the concept of me and you and all that, so that's why I had you close your eyes, because then it's easier.
Yeah.
And I had you to just experientially, see, we have to go by experience, just listen to where that voice is coming from. You instantaneously said, it's here, it's in my consciousness, right?
Well, if the me is presence, if I'm presence, then it seems to me that when I look at a tree, the tree should be appreciated predominantly as presence, if the tree is me. But I'm not so sure I get that, you know. I don't want to be disingenuous in my own experience. I mean, I don't want to hamper it by throwing in unnecessary doubts, but at the same time, I don't want to, I've always had this tendency to not want to claim anything that I don't feel I'm really experiencing.
And that's really good, because otherwise if it's false, then it's not true, and it's not congruent, and that's not right. But at the same time, maybe because, see, the sensory experience, when we engage through senses, it takes over, right? So we have a habit of, and that's the habit of still identifying with the body, right? When you have your eyes open and you look at a tree, I'm looking at the plant here, and if you're looking through your senses, you are going to see you and it, right? If you're looking through that knowing that you have within, you see, if you go back to that knowing, I wonder what would happen if you would just sit and there's a tree and you would not engage, you know, the senses that want to interpret for you. This is me, this is the tree. That interpretation happens so habitual, you don't even know that it's happening. Before you know, your brain has relayed information to you and you're like, yeah, well, that's me, that's the tree and whatever. But if you would listen with this deeper sense of, you know, presence or truth, I wonder what would be your experience.
That's interesting. And of course, you still have to use your senses. I mean, if you were blind, if I were blind, we wouldn't see the plant or the tree. Someone would have to tell us it's there unless we felt it with another sense, you know, or it made some noise or something. So we still have to use our senses. But I guess you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a kind of a way of experiencing in which the senses are still functioning, but there's something deeper that is perhaps more predominant or as part of the mix there, through which you are actually experiencing. It's almost like the deeper level of what you are is communing with the deeper level of what the tree is, and that's how it's known.
You know it, and you know it before thought, right?
Yeah.
You know it before thinking. You know it before you know it's an object. You know, and even a blind person, I would say, because I live in a lot, because of my sensitivities, I live with no electricity most of the time. So I live a lot in the dark, you see, and yet in the dark, you know, outer dark, right? Yeah. And yet there is that sense of knowing and things, you know, that is prior to thinking, right? It's we know things, you know, we just, and the reason I'm saying I'm not trying to take anything away from your experience, but I'm just pointing you that somewhere, without knowing, you still, you know, use the sensory as the guiding post. It's not that we are not to have the sensory. The sensory is important. In the very deep samadhi, there is no sensory.
Right.
But then the sensory is important when we are in the body. But what is it that you rely on when you are in the inner, right? Are you relying on your knowing, or are you relying on the senses? The senses is still here. It's not. We are trying to deny or suppress, you know. But where is your attention? Right?
True. I mean, if you're really inner, if you're meditating or something, then the senses are, as it says in the Gita, turning within like a tortoise withdrawing its limbs. So you're not really engaging them at all. And then, but of course, we can't exist in that state all the time. We have to eat and earn a living and stuff. So we're engaging our senses. But you just taught me something interesting that I don't think I had really thought of, or at least not. It wasn't kind of in the forefront of my understanding, which is that, you know, you begin to function in a way in which the sort of there's something deeper than the senses, or perhaps it's a subtle realm of the senses that begins to operate, and that begins to interact with objects of perception at their deeper level as well, and to appreciate the deeper level of the thing, rather than just what the gross surface perception has to offer. Is that correct?
Right. And what I'm saying is that in the awakening, that sense of, you know, ground shifts.
Yeah.
Now we are coming from a different ground, you see. It's not that the senses have to disappear, and, you know, they may disappear at moments and then they might appear back at moments. It doesn't matter. It's the body, right? But what matters is that ground that we come from. And in this ground, everything is, you see.
Yeah.
Everything is, and everything same, no different, right? Different in form, different in appearance, but not different in the essence, right?
Now, still on this theme of awakening and what it is and so on, I read a quote by a Zen master at one point, and he spoke about having had, you know, many awakenings over the years, some major, some minor. And the analogy occurred to me of like education. Someone could go to the first grade and study arithmetic, and he might say, okay, I am doing mathematics. And he's right. But he's not doing what a PhD student in mathematics is doing. But both things are mathematics, and yet there's been this sort of evolution of what they're doing. Now that's of course just a metaphor, but in terms of awakening, can you honestly, can we honestly say that there can be an awakening, and it's valid and it's legitimate and it's exactly what you've defined in terms of shifting one's orientation to presence being the predominant identity, but then there could be, you know, numerous levels of deepening and clarification of that over time. But feel free to disagree if you do, because this is just a...
Yeah, and first of all, you know, when we say many awakenings, then we have to define, right?
Yeah.
Because I remember having a lot of amazing experiences before this that I could have called awakening, right? And back then, maybe for a better lack of understanding, but luckily I wasn't very educated in the spiritual terminology, you see, so I didn't have the points of reference to like say, well, this was it and this was not, but they were extreme states, blissful, you know, beautiful, you know, expanded, and I could have called that awakening, you see. Because since this, there is no, in a one sense, there is no change.
Right.
There is no, that is not going anywhere, right? That is not evolving in any way, right? What is really evolving is the embodiment of that.
Yeah.
Right? What is really evolving is how that knowing informs everything that arises here. Right? That's what has changed. Then I can say from that time, if we look at time, at whenever that happened to this time, there is a tremendous change in the embodiment of that. There isn't change in the actual experience of it. You know, here it is. It was like that before too. Right?
Let me pursue that a little bit more. So, I understand about embodiment. We'll elaborate on that more. But no change in the actual experience of it. So, does that mean that if, again, using a metaphor, if we compare it to a light, it's not like the light is getting brighter and brighter and brighter. It's still light. It's not, you know, changing from one thing to another. It's still light, but it's getting brighter all the time. So would you say that your actual appreciation of presence is getting clearer, more profound, or anything, or is it just it is what it is?
The truth is the truth. You know, the truth is the truth. That is the truth. You know, so the actual knowing that this is not this body or this mind or these senses that arise here, that has not changed.
Okay. And when you say knowing, you don't just mean an intellectual thing. You mean an experiential thing.
Experiential. That hasn't changed, right? That was there from that very moment. You know, it was there. Wow. And back then it was new. Now it's not new anymore. You know, back then it was like, wow. And now it's like, yeah, it's normal, right? Right. What has really changed though is, you know, what has really changed is how that has penetrated through the levels of personality, through the levels of, you know,
perception,
conditioning or understanding, you know, how deeply that has informed now everything that arises here, and how the expression, see, if I would look at, you know, how I used to speak about it however many years ago and how I speak about it right now, the expression has changed tremendously, right? And the reason for that change is because there has been an inner change, right? There has been an inner willingness to just say, okay, let me be here. Let me just sit with what arises. Let me not assume anything. Let me not land in any spiritual understanding. Let me not assume anything, you know, from what I know already, right? Let me just see in a moment over and over and over again, right? Can I be here? Can I be here? Is this it too? Is this the truth also? Can I also in this find truth and rest and peace and quiet, even when that arises? Is that truth, right? Let me not land anywhere. Let me not land in understanding. Let me not land in awakening, right? Let me not land in that either, right?
So that willingness has made you cooperative, so to speak, and you've been a willing patient lying still on the operating table while nature rearranges your brain.
We can say at times cooperating, right? At times resisting, like no.
Yeah, but ultimately you haven't.
So, what other choices there? You know,
Right.
Once you know nothing. See, the thing is, once you know, nothing is satisfying anymore.
Yeah.
Nothing can satisfy other than this knowing, right?
Mm.
It just really doesn't. So.
And I presume this is an ongoing process. Like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you might say to me, you know, remember when we did that thing back in...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So how about the word enlightenment? I mean, at least in terms of your use of that word, is there any sort of ultimate endpoint to all this process, and we might reserve the word enlightenment for that? Or would you use it just synonymously with awakening, and then probably in your understanding there is no endpoint?
You know, I would be very careful, because there's many different kinds of information about it out there, you know, so I'm very careful not to use the word enlightenment, and I'm rather, you know, using it one and the same as awakening, right, or very close, you know, yeah. And because that's how Papaji used it, you know, he used it just, you know, as one thing, that he wasn't really speaking much about the differences, you know, even though I could say there are some differences, right? But, you know, what Ramana says, what is interesting, you know, what I read in a little obscure little book, you know, that the Ramana Ashram has published a long time ago, is that, you see, because once awakening or enlightenment, whatever we call it, it happens, there's no volition anymore, you see. Volition this is the end of that movement, like I want to know it, I want to get it, I want to understand it. That's the volition, right? That's the individual still looking for something, searching, right? So there's end of volition, right? So there really isn't anymore, if that's the true state, right? There isn't anymore an individual looking for anything anymore, right? However, what he describes is that there are 4 or 3 other stages that happen, but they happen as a destiny of a particular individual, right? That they were different individuals on the planet, and then there are different individuals on the planet that can reach that, for example, state of living in the Turiya, living in the 4th state, you know, where there is just no memory, and there is no time, and there is no, you know, and there's that much greater, you know, knowing of or transcending of this individual kind of experience. But that doesn't happen by desire, you see. That happens of its own, right? If that was the destiny of the individual. So he says there are 3 other stages, but they are not reached by wanting, right? You can't reach them, you know, because you sit here and think, well, I would like this, right?
So if it's your destiny or your dharma or the way you happen to be wired, then maybe you will reach them. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So what happened for me a long time ago, you see, what happened for me a long time ago was you know, everything fell away, and any interest in anything other than being here fell away. Right? So there stopped to be interest in what is this and what is that, and what kind of state am I in, and is this or is that, and how does that measure on this scale, or all of that, which in the beginning still as an imprint was still functional, you see. There was still some time, some years, you know, that it was functional, like, yeah, awakening, sure, yeah, awakening, and this, you know, and then that fell away too, you see.
And yet you've devoted your life to spirituality and to teaching spirituality, and so obviously this still is your most ardent interest.
When I say it fell away, what fell away was needing to know anything, see,
or be certain about anything.
Or anything, because what is here in the moment? In the moment, either you are at rest and knowing your true nature, you are suffering. Right? There's only these 2 options. So if you really, you know, in my experience, if you really want to just be very, 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 very clear and very adamant about where are you at, that's all that matters, right? You know, who's going to measure that, right? What's the measurement? Who's interested? You know, who needs to know? Are we here or are we there, or what is the state? Or you know, that was still there a little bit as a construct, as a structure, you know, and that fell away naturally, right? And the interest became only, can I be here?
And yet, as a teacher, I've heard you give nice talks for half hour, 45 minutes at a stretch about some particular topic, and you sound very knowledgeable. So you do know things, and you impart that knowledge as a teacher.
You know, at some point what I realized is, because in the beginning when I was teaching, I was just sharing the direct experience. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't really even speak much back then, because see, there was not much integration between that awakened state and the body mind. You know, the brain wouldn't function. There wouldn't be any, you know, words that would come, right? So and after a while though, I realized that, you know, what the knowing of the direct experience of presence is not necessarily everything that my students need to know. Mm. There's a difference there, right? Like, I don't live in that, thinking about it, right? And yet when I come to teach, I recognize, oh, that knowledge needs to be or verbalized in some way. That inner experience needs to be shared in some way. That, you know, understanding of what's happening has to be somehow explained to others, right? But it's not necessarily, you know, like, what I'm trying to say is, like, when I live my life moment by moment, there isn't really any kind of reflection of, like, who am I and why am I like this and what's, you know what I mean? Like, that kind of doesn't happen.
Yeah, that would just be a lot of mental agitation.
Exactly. It's just natural, just being here. Right?
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah. And of course, I mean, again, it might relate back to how we're wired, because there have been a number of great sages who have been really erudite and written, you know, like Shankara, written these long, complicated things, and that was his forte. That was his skill.
Exactly. And in a way, I see that, you know, the challenge of my health has brought a certain, you know, a certain opportunity with it, right? Mm. Because not being able to travel, not being able to see people in person, not being able to do the things that I used to do, there was a lot of deepening in the real, true understanding of what it means moment by moment, you know, can I be here? And how to work with what arises here, and how to understand the body, the nervous system, the brain more, to really help it to be able to come to rest, right? So there has been a lot of deepening, and from it, see, that's what you were listening to, you write hours and hours and hours. From it, there have been a lot of different topics that would arise here, and a lot of different things that would arise to speak about and to share, right? Which really are the result of just this inner process, though, I'm trying to say, you see. It's a result of what's going on the inner, right? And then it wants to express itself, and it wants to share it with others too, to say, hey, you know, this is, we could look at that, right? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that's an interesting phenomenon, actually. It seems like people go through all sorts of things, and even though those things might not be something we would request or, you know, hope for because they're difficult, but they all end up being part of our toolkit, you know? And if we end up becoming a teacher, a lot of people I've spoken to, they say that they don't regret a single thing. You know, like, for instance, Adyashanti was on Oprah the other day, and he said he went through a period of life after his initial awakening, which was really hell for about 5 years. But he said he wouldn't change a thing because it sort of endowed him with certain capabilities as a result of those experiences.
Exactly, and we never know, you know. So that's why I don't try to analyze, you know, where I'm at. I'm just like, okay, here I am, here it is. Can we be here, right? Yeah. Is that what we can do?
So another thing I'm interested in about presence, like you were, mentioning Adyashanti, for instance, he had an experience similar to yours where he was sitting at a bus stop and he said, I just want to know the truth, and I don't care
exactly
what happens to me. It could be hell, it could be heaven. I just want to know it. Bring it on. And sure enough, it came on.
You go.
And you said kind of a similar thing. And what I find interesting about that is that it's almost as if somebody's listening. You know, that intelligence which is governing the universe is, you know, seek and you shall find. It's sort of like if we reach out from our side with that sincere intention, we get a response. Maybe you could respond to that, and I'll ask another question about it.
You know, because the teacher is the inner, right? Mm-hmm. The true teacher is the inner. However, if we could fully surrender into what we know on the inner, then we wouldn't need an outer teacher, right?
Right.
But most of us, there are examples. Ramana.
Yeah, Ramana.
There in Dan, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what it means Dan. Also, I don't want to put labels, but no human teacher, right? And most of us though don't fully know how to surrender to the inner, to what the inner is telling us is true, right? So the way consciousness responds is when there's true desire for freedom, it would respond.
Mm-hmm.
It would respond by bringing us in touch with the teacher.
Yeah.
And it would respond by bringing us in touch with the teacher who can speak to us in the words that we understand, right?
And that teacher may be a human teacher, or it may be a disease, or it may be whatever we need, it seems.
Whatever it is, right. Whatever it is that helps us to trust that inner experience, right? Whatever helps us to trust it.
But to me, the fascinating implication of that is that, presence is not just merely some kind of, I don't know, just it's not, it has intelligence to it. It's responsive. It's if we look deeply enough into what we mean when we say the word presence, think of your thumb and what's actually going on in there on the molecular level, the biological level, the atomic level. There's this incredible, world of intricate interactions and things going on, all so orderly and intelligent in their functioning. To me, it begins to speak of God. That presence.
Yeah, we can say what powers that, right?
Yeah.
So we can call it. There's many ways to call it, right? Presence, consciousness, space, God, right? Even though I don't really relate to God as a person, right?
No, not an isolated person, but
just the force, right? Because what powers that? What powers anything, right?
Yeah. Well, it's amazing if you think about it. Presence. Some people, you hear the word presence. Eckhart Tolle talks about the now, and you just think of this sort of dumb mass of being or presence with no. It could evoke that kind of understanding, but if you actually think about what's actually going on in everything you see and everything that's within and without you, there's this infinitely awesome orchestra taking place. This
yes.
That's I think fascinating, when you say things like you have a desire and then presence responds by giving you this experience or bringing you this teacher or something. It always reminds me of that we're not talking about some kind of mechanistic thing or mere sort of being. We're talking about a sentient, maybe an omnipresent sentience, but a vast intelligence that we seem to be just immersed in, that pervades everything.
For sure.
I'm talking a bit too much, but I
oh, that's good. It's good. You need to.
That particular point just kind of intrigues me, and I enjoy bouncing it off people that I interview to see how they feel about that.
Sure. Yeah.
Have you found, for instance, you've talked about since your awakening, that the embodiment has progressed through many, many stages. Have you found a dawning of kind of a deeper sense of devotion or expansion of the heart? For instance, Ramana had his awakening, and then he spent his life devoted to the intelligence that was embodied in Arunachala, and many other spiritual people have, it seems that, like Adyashanti again, he had his initial awakening, and then over time he just began to be fascinated with the person of Jesus, and he felt like Zen, he actually said in that interview that Zen seemed kind of lacking in love, lacking in qualities of the heart, and it didn't satisfy him because he felt his own heart was blossoming after his awakening. So has that been a dimension of your experience since your initial awakening, and the embodiment you referred to? Has it had to do with growth of the heart?
I would say it really, if we call it the heart, then I would say it really is a continuous embracing or meeting of everything as is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really allowing for everything. Because you see, what I'm interested in lately, you know, as I'm speaking with students, because otherwise, you know, it's just my inner, right, experience. What I'm interested in is how does the impulse that arises in presence, right, how does that translate itself into action in our experience? And what are all the different other things that get involved? You know, our past, our conditioning, our, you know, whatever we think, whatever we believe, whatever we, you know, think this is good or this is bad or it should be here or it shouldn't be here, right? So a lot of the work that I do sitting myself and sitting with students is a work of, you know, what is present, right? Can I be present to that? Is that okay also, you see? Is when this particular state arises. Because when we have expanded states, that's easy. What about if we have difficult states? What about if we have pain? What about if we have anger? What about if we have frustration? What about if we want to go and kill somebody, right? What about if, you know, things, all sorts of things arise. Is that okay? Can we really be here, right? So you know, because that's what I consider love, you know, is really that, because love is natural, right? It's a natural quality that is already here. Most of the time we don't know that it's here because we are engaged with what arises, right? We are engaged with the motivation of the past, right? So for me, that interest is when you say, you know, the heart was blossoming, for me, it's like everything is included.
Yeah.
Can I be with this too? Is that okay? But not just okay, you know, when I'm sitting in meditation, right? Which is like, great, everything is okay, right? But is this okay when somebody, you know, is angry with you? Is this okay when you have a challenging interaction with somebody? Is this still okay when, you know, the events in the world happen that are happening right now? Is it still okay when, you know, the climate change that we are dealing with and the effects of that, is that still okay then? See, does that have place? And does what arises here in response to that, is that okay also?
Okay, now you just used the word okay about 20 times, so we better talk about what we really mean by okay. So when you say okay, do you mean that you can take it in stride, you can accept it as it is without arguing with reality? Is that what you mean by okay?
Yes, that's what I mean. That's what I mean. And what I mean again is that when you go right now to the inner, right, and in this moment, is everything okay the way it is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds very much like Byron Katie, the way she teaches, you know. She's
Well, it's the natural state, right? We can have many ways of wording it, you see. The reason why I like to use the word okayness is because, you know, when we are quiet, it's all obvious, right? When, let's say, you got extremely aggravated, you know, in your relationship and you're going through a big drama internally, right? And so if we really work with okayness, but really not mental concept, and you would ask yourself, is what is present right now okay?
And if you really are established in accepting what is as okay, would you really take a very oppositional position in a relationship or in some other situation? In other words, would you stir up as much drama as somebody who is not accustomed to seeing everything is okay and this person is wrong and that idea is wrong and they're in opposition to things?
It's even deeper than that, because first, you know, when we go into relating, we first need to recognize that okayness is true for everything.
Yeah.
Is the ground of your experience, is the ground of your partner's experience, is the ground of the experience of everything in the world. Right? So when we use okayness as an inquiry, when we ask ourselves, is something okay? We are not in there and saying, where am I at right now? Am I really in the truth of what I know? Right? Am I really resting in the okayness of everything as is? Or am I engaging in drama, right? And so first, you know, rather than trying to be anywhere, I use this question of okayness as a, you know, the answer is yes or no. And if it's a yes, right on, let's be here. If it's a no, we have to clarify our relationship with what is, because otherwise we can process what is forever. And we are never going to get satisfied, because that stuff can't be satisfied. The story can't be satisfied, right? But if we come back to the sense of, true, real inner okayness, that will be the beginning of our inquiry, right? And then we come back to that. And now that doesn't mean, though, and this is where the translation is so important, that doesn't mean that you're not going to go back to your partner and say, what you just did was not okay. See?
You may say that, but it seems like there would be a different quality to it than if you were not established in presence. You know, it's like, you know, there's so many people who are so contentious these days. The Republicans hate the Democrats hate the Republicans, and, you know, there's all this, the Israelis and the Palestinians. I mean, it seems that if all these people were really established in a deep sense of abiding presence, that there might still be differences of opinion and philosophy and, you know, and all, but there wouldn't be this rancor and bitterness and outright warfare as a result of,
Exactly.
of these sorts of differences.
And even if they were not established, if they were willing, you see, rather than always looking out there, if they were willing to, for a moment, look within and see, am I actually at rest, right?
Right.
Is this experience here really knowing that everything is okay the way it is, right? Or resting in presence, or whatever we call it, if there was a willingness to do that, you see. But what I see in the world more is, because there are so many changes happening. First of all, there's billions of people on the planet. That's a huge, humongous collective consciousness, right? That means a huge amount of tendencies, see? A huge amount of tendencies that come to be experienced, right? That itself affects the planet, the consciousness tremendously, right? Then we have the huge changes of the climate change. There's a huge, deep change going on for so many years already, that only now it becomes, you know, like more common knowledge, right? Meaning now everybody's talking about it, and many years ago only a few were talking about it, right? So it's much more visible. But these changes affect us. You see. The human body is affected by it. You see, I don't know if you noticed, but there's so much more conflict on the planet right now. First of all, because there's so many more, as I say, so many billions of people, but also we are affected by all these changes that are going on. See, this little nervous system, this little brain, you know, that is all connected, it's all interconnected, there's no separation. And so there is more, you know, tension because of that, right? There's more conflict.
Hard to say if there's more conflict. I don't know. We'd have to ask an historian. We're not in the middle of World War II or anything like that. We're not burning witches on the town square. There's a lot of things that have improved, but there's definitely a lot of strife and a lot of, you know, seemingly irreconcilable differences among people. And it seems to me that, you know, this bit more, even a little bit more introspection, if not a deep diving into presence, is the antidote.
But this is, you know, why I said so many billions of human beings on the planet, so many tendencies present.
Yeah.
Right? The tendencies come here to be cleared. Most of the people, the gross of the 7 billion or however many billions already there are, is not interested in that, you see.
What did you mean by that just now? The tendencies come here to be cleared.
To be experienced, right?
By whom?
Well, why would there be even birth in a human body? Why would there be even birth, right? Why would consciousness need to incarnate into any body? Because we are in a human body, but look, there's billions of other beings, right, on the planet, right? And other planets.
And billions of other planets.
Exactly. So why would even incarnation be happening? What is incarnation? Incarnation is tendencies. What are tendencies? Tendencies is the postponement of being here. Right? Tendencies is the idea that there will be a time in the future that we will get to experience something that we don't have right now. And therefore, we have to keep going, right? Consciousness has to keep going, looking for these experiences, right? Because if it looks for these experiences, then eventually there's going to be this time, that is going to be this perfect experience of something, right? And we get these moments, we get a second of it, and then it's like, well, that's over. Okay, looking for the next one, right? So these are tendencies. And we can say, if you and I are talking here, sitting in this interview, and whoever is watching, the predominant tendency would be the tendency for freedom, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't be here talking about it, right?
Wouldn't be interested in this. Yeah.
Exactly. However, there are other imprints that have not been cleared, right? That brought us into the human body, and why to know our true nature, right? But here is also the time to meet the past, to not to perpetuate anymore, to not to go through another cycle of there's going to be an experience out there sometime, somewhere, that is going to be better than what is here, right?
There's a lot in that you just said. In listening to talks,
I'm sorry, maybe it's too much information.
No, it's good. I'm trying to think of there are about 5 different ways I could go with this, so you've alluded to reincarnation just now, and I heard you talk about it in your talks, and it makes a lot of sense to me that as a soul we go through many lives experiencing different things. And you also alluded just now to what I would call a sort of an evolutionary impulse, that it's at the heart of everything, and that really is probably at the heart of creation itself, that without which we wouldn't have a creation. We wouldn't have stars forming and eventually exploding and forming heavier elements which form our bodies. I'm sure you know that everything in our body was once part of a star. So there's this sort of, how did that happen? It didn't happen randomly or by like little billiard balls running into each other. So there's this kind of evolution toward greater and greater complexity, greater expression of forms capable of, or evolution of forms capable of experiencing being, experiencing consciousness, capable of having the intelligence which governs the universe experience itself with greater clarity and embodying that to greater and greater degrees. So it almost, sometimes people put the emphasis on, we have all these tendencies, we're on this cycle, we're on this wheel of karma, we want to get off and just end the whole thing. And maybe that's a valid perspective, but isn't there also, can't we give God some credit for having created the universe for a purpose? And that purpose meaning being to bring into existence 2 beings like you and I who can have a conversation like this about something which we can actually experience, which is a far cry from what it was before the Big Bang.
But we have to start in the beginning with, when we are really truly at rest, right?
Yeah.
Where is the universe, right? What is the universe?
In our experience.
Yeah. When we are truly in peace. Why don't you just do that again, Rick? Let's just do it again together, When we are in the moment here sitting quietly and you direct your attention towards your inner, beautiful. Then where is the universe, right? Or what is it?
In my experience, it's less active, although I have a brain which is enabling me to have that experience, and that brain there's trillions of cells doing things in that brain.
Into the human body, and then we go into the perceptions and all that. But when we sit in the real deep truth, then we know that universe arises in presence. Right?
Yes.
So even though we have to talk in this dualistic way, and I talk in this way too, because if I want to explain certain things, like if I want to help my students to direct their attention towards tendencies that oftentimes remain invisible, right? Tendencies that bring us here, and we kind of have a blind spot, an avoidance of like, whoa, let's not go there. And that eventually is a seed that would need to continue in some way, right? So I need to be able to speak in these dual ways. And yet, when we look at, like when we sit truly in presence, then we can see what universe arises in presence, right?
Yes.
So it's an experience that we are having, right? And the consciousness is having an experience of this. Consciousness is having an experience of being in the body. Consciousness is having an experience of having a conversation with you. Consciousness is having an experience of billions of humans being on the planet right now, struggling with whatever they are struggling with, right? So we need to keep it in that perspective, because as I see it, if we take the universe as just the entity that exists on its own independently, then we are missing a little bit that, it arises it's here as an experience. Right?
Exactly. and it's here as a mechanism through which consciousness can experience itself,
and through which consciousness can reach freedom.
Reach freedom.
Exactly, because there's a reason why, you know, we are here, and why we are going through what we are going through, and why we have to go through it, and why we say, well, why is this happening to me, or why is this happening to this person, why is this going on? And there's, you know, there's a reason to that, as long as we can see it as, oh, that's what it is, can I be here? Rather than, oh my God, why is this happening? Or I wish it wasn't here.
It's funny because you can kind of swing back and forth from seeing it from an individual perspective or seeing it from the perspective of the, you know, the universal consciousness, and from that perspective, how could consciousness ever have not been free, you know?
Right. Exactly.
From the individual perspective, it seems like something we want to get to, you know?
And yet it doesn't know it, you see, because these tendencies that are here, these are like little seeds that believe themselves to be something other than what they are.
Yeah.
This is, you know, we need to, you know, that it needs to know itself, right? It needs to know itself.
I'm just looking up, there's this great T.S. Eliot quote. He says, hang on a minute. I'm not finding it right now, but there's something about the journey. You know, we go through this whole rigmarole and we come back to where we started and know the place for the first time.
Right,
you know?
right, beautiful.
Okay, but when you talk about tendencies, I kind of took it to a metaphysical level, but when you're talking about tendencies, you're talking about vasanas, impressions, ingrained ways of behavior that keep us kind of constricted.
Exactly. Or that keep us, because what a tendency is, as I said, is a postponement, right? It's a postponement of being present with what is, right? And that postponement has been going on for a really long time, right?
Yeah.
So it has been here before this life, and that's the only reason why I talk about it, because otherwise we wouldn't even be in this life, right? If there were not certain impressions that are still drawing us into this experience, right? There wouldn't even be that experience. Why? Why would it be necessary, right?
And we are repositories of many such impressions, right? We are just bundles of them, and so it's not like we should want anyone to feel guilty if they, you know, are drawn outward or don't appreciate, you know, presence fully in this moment, because a lot of this stuff, you know, we're so wired from so many lifetimes of impressions that's going to tend to keep happening.
Exactly, and that's why my interest is so closely on the inner, you know, where am I at?
Yeah.
Am I at rest or am I suffering? Because when the tendency arises, it's usually so habitual and so familiar that it feels like me, right? It feels like who you are. And before you know you are acting on it, you are engaged, and that engagement recharges that tendency.
Reinforces, yeah.
Reinforces it, makes it stronger, right? So, yeah.
Okay, so you're saying that by kind of catching it and coming back to the self, we could say, coming back to presence, you take the steam out of it, you
and then
diminish it.
Exactly, catching it and being, first of all, being aware that that's a tendency, right? Rather than, you see, even people who have had deep awakening, right? I know a lot of people, and I talk to a lot of friends. We still have the nervous system and the brain and all that, and there's still tendencies here, and so even there can be still a misunderstanding, right? When something arises, it can feel like so like natural, but it really isn't, right? It's just the past, right? So first of all, we need to really, you know, go back and even know that this is the past, right? But then the reason why we are born in the human body, I'm sure you know, you heard many times, that is one of the prerequisites for freedom. Right? Yes. Why would that be, right? Because first of all, we have that intelligence, which can be so much trouble, right? But it also gives us that self-reflection. Like so many times today, we said, okay, just go and look on the inner, right? So it gives you the capacity to go and look right into our true nature, first of all, right? But it also gives us a nervous system and the brain, you see? And so when the past arises, one of the reasons that it hasn't been finished is that it hasn't been experienced. And so now we have a nervous system and the brain that can do that, right? So when the tendency of the past arises, and if we can recognize it for what it is, rather than engaging it, we can say, okay, can I be here? And what can I be here means, it means, can I really allow the full experience of it in this body, right? Without engaging it, without suppressing it? But can I allow it to really run through? That's part of the reason why we are born in a human body. Right? Can it really be present? The excitement of it, the shakiness of it, the fear of it, the whatever that is, can that content that was holding it in this, seed, right? Can that content fully come and just be here? And can it be experienced? And can it be then recognized like, oh, there was just, an imprint, there was just an energy that moved through. That's all it was, really, right? Because when it's recognized for what it really is, which is in its essence, everything is our true nature, right? Then it doesn't have to keep doing this thing over and over and over again. Right? And sometimes, and I'm sorry, but sometimes we have to do that over and over and over and over again until the charge of it, which we don't know how long it has been here, maybe millions of years, it has been repeating itself, right? We don't know that charge until the charge really diminishes, and then it's done, you see? Then it doesn't have to continue, right?
Sure. To some, well, you can just think in terms of conditioning, I mean, even Pavlov, this just basically we're habitual creatures. Things get deeply ingrained. And whether it's, and you can take extreme examples such as drug addiction or, behavioral tendencies. Let's take an example. Like, for instance, maybe you have a tendency to get angry at people. And how most people, many people would just react blindly without thinking, without self-reflection, get angry when the impulse arises. What you're saying, well, let you say what you're saying. How would you recommend doing it differently?
Well, first of all, when I say tendency, I mean there's something prior to this life experience. Right? So when we come into this body, there's already tendencies.
And there could be new tendencies that were formed in this life.
Right. Where we say, the baby is so innocent. That's true. And it wouldn't be here if there wasn't some, past pushing it into this, right?
Right.
So the tendencies are already here, right? They are not just, and yet they reinforce themselves throughout of this life experience, right? So because of certain tendencies, we will be already drawn into certain situations in this life, right?
Yeah.
Which would reinforce that tendency, right?
So take a particular example, whether the one I just brought up, getting angry at people, or some other one if you'd like to choose it. And maybe let's draw a contrast between how people ordinarily would do it and reinforce it, or how you would recommend dealing with it so as to unreinforce it.
You want to take it more into the practical level, and that's a little, that's a little higher up than just kind of understanding how it all works. But let's just take it there, okay? So on the practical level, for that, reaction from anger to be there, there had to be somewhere, we don't know when, a prior movement away from our true nature. Because when we are at rest in our true nature, it will be rare that we would react, because anger is natural too, and sometimes anger is important, right, as an expression, but it will be rare that we'll just react from anger, right? So that means that movement away has already happened, right, somewhere. So when somebody is really actually has a lot of reactivity from anger, I would say, okay, let's slow it down, right? Let's notice it as an experience in your body. Let's sense it for a moment. Let's come out of the thinking about it, let's kind of drop that. Let's bring it back to the sensory, and let's just kind of notice it as an experience, right? Let's just say, is it okay for it to be here right now? Somebody would say yes or no, right? And then we can, okay, depending on what it is, we would sit with it in a certain particular way, right?
And so when you say okay, it means that rather than pick up the phone and yell at so-and-so, you're asking them to kind of put their attention more within and maybe feel the physiology or some kind of inner impulse that's spurring them to that kind of action.
And I am asking also them to ask themselves, is it okay that this impulse is present right now? Are they okay with it or not? And then we just do a little inquiry. Let me just explain this. We just sit with it for a while until something shifts and they come back to rest. Right? And when they come back to rest, then they regain perspective. And then they go like, oh, there's other options. It doesn't just have to be, screaming, right? There's other options. Okay, right? Regain perspective because we came back to rest, right?
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying that there's a cycle. Action, impression, desire. We perform an action, it creates an impression that plants the seeds of future desires, which gives rise to another impression, another action, and so on. And what you're saying is nip it in the bud, and rather than perpetuate this cycle, break the cycle by just coming back to kind of a self-referral, self-awareness kind of thing, feeling the sensation if it's there, and not necessarily acting reflexively.
Exactly, but not suppressing it either.
Not suppressing it, but maybe
experiencing the heat of it, the challenge of it, the emotion of it, how it manifests in the body. Let's have it. Let's have the sensation. We don't want to suppress it, but we want to really experience it, to go like, oh, okay, we can be here. You see, that movement doesn't have to take our attention away from who we are.
Yeah. And it sounds like feeling it like that would actually produce the physiological change necessary to sort of eliminate that impression in the brain, in the nervous system.
Exactly. It would change the pathway in the brain over time. Mm-hmm. Right? It would change the pathway, and it would really, as you say, it will eliminate it over time as an impression, right? It wouldn't be there. Right?
Yeah.
But let's say in that case, I would go even deeper, and I would see how come somebody is so reactive, right? What is the experience of the past that made them so that they can't be here?
Well, you're not asking them to go back to a past life and realize that they, were mistreated or something like that.
Well, I'm not asking them to go anywhere, but I'm saying, if they were experiences in their past, this past, current past, or other past, that resulted in a certain unresolved charge. Mm-hmm. That is still present, mm-hmm. then that charge is what we want to meet, you see.
Without necessarily knowing the specifics of those experiences.
We don't know the specifics, but sometimes the specifics come up. That's okay, but that's not what we are looking for.
Right.
We are just looking to see like, oh, there is this charge, and that charge has been here for a really long time ago. And when anything touches that charge, delicate touch, there's like, right? That reactivity happens. So that reactivity is almost a secondary pattern, right? Because the primary is, there is something I can't be with. There's something I had to, and I personalize. I mean, I say I because I don't know how to say it otherwise. There's something we couldn't be here with before.
In your own experience, when you first started doing this after your awakening, was there like a whole shitload, to use that expression, of stuff that was coming on fast and furious that you had to deal with, and then it gradually diminished over time, and now it's kind of tapered off to a trickle? Or has there been a pretty consistent, momentum?
In the beginning, there was a very spontaneous, natural just arising, and things would just turn over almost by itself, right? And then eventually, after some period of time, I don't remember, the specifics of time, but it hit on some kind of resistance. Mm-hmm. See, there was some inner resistance, and there was for a moment, luckily just for a moment, some sense of wanting to identify with the awakened state rather than being present to what is, right? And luckily that has, been seen very, very quickly, but what was missing in my personal, experience was something that I call tenderness. Right? There was a lot of, just coming from my conditioning, there was a lot of harshness about being with certain states. And then there was a certain level of arrogance from that awakeness too, that just thought like, whatever, this is not important, we don't have to be here, right? Well, what's this nonsense, let's not mess with it, right? But there was that tenderness missing of just, okay, this is what's here, can I be here? And eventually there was that shift. And, because I remember back then dealing with some physical challenges, and I remember suddenly going like, wait a minute, let me just be here. And then suddenly realizing, whoa, this is just, this is the way to go, because in being here, that's what eventually relaxes what is here, and that eventually, you know, when we really come back to rest, everything begins to orientate by that. You know, everything goes like, oh yeah, that's great. I can be here now. That's wonderful. You know, so.
That's interesting. So it kind of sounds like, you know, once that awakening occurred, then a lot of rearrangement needed to take place. And in your experience, you know, there was this tendency of arrogance or of harshness or whatever, but that stuff was coming to your awareness, to your attention, because it needed to be swept out. It needed to be resolved.
Exactly. It needed to be met, you know, it needed to be seen for what it is rather than just perpetuate, right?
And it might have been there even before the awakening, but you might have been blind to it or something.
Of course. I'm sure there was. I'm sure it was. And then on top of it, it became maybe a little bit of a spiritual conditioning, you know, which, by the way, so much of it out there, you know, spiritual conditioning, right? Like what we think is spiritual and how it's supposed to be, and rather than the true being with what is here, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you talked a lot in your recordings about authenticity, and that what you just said reminds me of that. And my interpretation or impression of authenticity is just, you know, not mood making. I mean, not sort of clinging to an attitude or a belief or just some, like trying to take refuge in some sort of spiritual mindset, but just being genuinely, you know, what you are, not trying to gloss over it in any way.
Yeah, and is the inner, the true knowing on the inner and the outer, the expression, is it congruent?
Yeah.
Is there congruency between the real knowing of what we know, and then how does that translate when you talk to your friend? How does that translate when you are with your spouse or your partner? How does that translate when you are with your children? How does it translate when you are interacting with the world? Is it still congruent, or is it just, I know the truth, and then, you know, something else happens when there's action, right?
Yeah. So, do you walk your talk?
Exactly.
A lot of times when you were talking, I was reminded of, you know, like the Tao Te Ching, which talks about being in tune with the Tao, you know, and it even talks about rulers ruling countries if they're in tune with the Tao, and how smoothly and in tune with nature, really, or the Gita, you know, action in accordance with Dharma. That if we're sort of isolated in constricted individual consciousness without an appreciation of that sort of deeper, more universal value, then we're just kind of kicking around with very partial understanding and appreciation of things and making a mess, you know. But if a lot of what you said reminded me of those principles of just acting from a settled state, settled in presence, and then who's really the actor then? There's a saying, Brahman is the charioteer.
Yeah, and also recognizing, though, that when that action really is based on our past, to really the difference, you see, and if necessary, do what is needed, which is inquiry. And if necessary, make amendments in the world if that action has harmed anything or anybody in some way. And really, so that brings everything into congruence, you see. It's not about perfect, right? Because we can also think like, what's that perfect state, you know, and nothing ever goes wrong, you know. But no, you know, we are all just in it learning as we are learning, right? So if we recognize later on, oh man, this was just my reactivity, you know, can I make amendments for that? Because that what brings the inner and the outer into congruence, right?
Yeah. I'm reminded of your fellow Papaji disciple, Andrew Cohen, whom I've interviewed, and, you know, there was a lot of controversy around him, and about a year ago or 6 months ago, he's just decided to stop teaching and completely do a self-inventory, and he's calling up people individually and apologizing for things he's done and all. There's this, you know, and he had a very profound awakening, but there was, I think, perhaps, but he would admit, and I mean, even I'm mentioning him because he's being very public about this, but he would admit that there was still a lot of conditioning governing his behavior. And, you know, a lot of people got kind of upset and disillusioned when he made this turn of heart. And a friend of mine who's been with him for years felt like, oh, he's just pulled the rug out under me. But my initial reaction was, right on, Andrew, that's fantastic. You know, what an evolutionary step for you.
Isn't it great? That's like how, you know, that's the, you know, that's what's needed, right? That's beautiful.
Yeah, it's like he deserves congratulations for coming to the realization that that was necessary, and for for trying to make amends, as you say.
Exactly, beautiful.
And a few years ago from now, maybe he'll come back as a teacher, but he'll be a much better one without all that.
Who knows, right? But at least there's that tiny little recognition and that step into like, oh, that's not enough, you see.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just know it and to know it in a certain way. That's not enough, you see. There's something else needed, you see.
Embodiment, house cleaning.
Exactly, congruence.
Congruence.
Right? Something is needed.
Yeah. So it almost seems like a person is not going to be, maybe a person can go on for a whole lifetime, acting inappropriately after awakening has dawned. But I get the impression that you're not going to be allowed to do that in most cases. It's eventually going to crack through you.
Exactly. Exactly. We hope, or something is going to.
Something's going to happen.
Or the people around you are finally going to say, "You got to be kidding, right?
Yeah, right.
You better clean up,"
Yeah. Huh. And do you think there are any people who eventually reach a point at which there is really little or nothing left to process, that they've really worked out all the vasanas?
I don't know that.
Do you think Papaji was that way?
I wouldn't comment on that. I don't know.
Hard to judge.
And I would say, when we talk about Papaji would say, somebody asked him, Papaji, do you still need to be vigilant? Right? And he would say, with every breath.
Yeah.
Because he says, you never know, when something can arise, you just never know. You see? And you have to be vigilant. There are also stories of Ramana and his disciples, and Ramana, when they were dying, in the process of dying, Ramana would sit with them and hold one hand on the heart and one on the head. He said, so that the Vasana can't escape, so that it's met here. And he said he was successful with one, but he was not successful with the other, because his attention moved and the Vasana escaped and it just went to another birth, right?
Interesting.
So, so it's like, well, See, that's what I mean when I said in the beginning, I'm just not thinking like that. What I'm really more interested in, where am I? Where is my attention? Right? Am I at rest or am I suffering? Right?
Each moment.
Exactly. What's going on here?
Yeah. I know you advocate taking a certain amount of time to just be in silence each day, either some sort of meditation or just sitting in silence. You want to elaborate a bit on the importance of that?
There's two or three different things I really recommend. One is, we need a quiet time for self-reflection and just, coming back to rest, right? The life is very engaging, and oftentimes there's a lot of things going on and we can easily get distracted by what's going on. And so that keep coming back, that's what brings that congruence. And it also brings a lot of insight about what are the tendencies that are moving, right? That's kind of that time. I also recommend a lot for people these days to sit in the awareness of the sensations in the body, because that's often missing and that's very different than meditation, but it really helps them later in the moment, or in inquiry, to be present to what is rather than just be totally, taken by the experience, right? And then of course inquiry, which is, can I be here? Can I be with what is here? Can I let it come to rest? Right? So.
All three of those things, there's some overlap too. I mean, you can be sitting in a meditative state and be aware of the sensations in the body and be processing stuff and all, but...
Yeah, it's a little, I find it a little different, but anyway, there are just some elements that I think are helpful these days.
Yeah. I'm reading some notes here that I think Lee or Nina sent me, and we've covered most of them. I'll just read you some of them, and
maybe we talk about relationship a little bit.
Yeah, okay, go for that. Let's do that.
Because that's one of the things that I talk about. If you have my interest in talking about it is because I find the being in relationships, not just intimate partnerships, but in general, that it really tells us so much about where we are.
Yeah. Ram Dass said, if you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your parents.
Exactly. So it's a very direct, inquiry. Right? No, you can't hide, right? And as I talk about relationships, I'm saying that there's a certain part of our conditioning that only arises when we relate, see. It doesn't arise that much when we are just on our own. So you can say, well, I was fine before I met you, right? Or I was fine before I talked to you, and then I talked to you and I'm not fine anymore, right? And what's not fine is because conditioning has arisen that has not been visible before. Right? So in that way, I see, if done rightly, not as an agenda, but as a awareness, relationships can be a great path to freedom. Right? But not as an agenda, like, well, we have to be in a relationship to be free. No, but if you happen to be in relationships in your life, which everybody is, in some kind of relationship, right? Then that can become a great way to really inquire into some of these tendencies or some of these conditionings that we don't know otherwise. Because when you are by yourself, they don't show up that strongly, even though they show up in the way we relate to work, in the way we relate to food, in the way we relate to our body, in the way we relate to the practice or sitting or inquiry. They show up in many ways too. But then when you relate, whoa, it just shows up very, very strongly. And that's then a great, place for inquiry.
Yeah. Well, 50% of all Americans get divorced. Mickey Rooney, who died recently, was married 8 times. So
I heard that. It's amazing.
Yeah. So seems like a lot of people haven't learned that lesson, and they probably have this outer directed thing of something's wrong here, it's your fault. I'm moving on. So as a teacher, how would you recommend to people that they use relationship as a teaching tool for discovering one's own weak points or whatever?
Right. Well, first of all, I would say a relationship that means 2 nervous systems arising in presence. Mm-hmm. So which we have to remember, because this nervous system is going through, the other is going through similar things, it's just a little different. But 2 nervous systems arising in presence, so that means, when, so that's first really important to recognize that it's not, that what is going on here is not so different than what is going on over there, you see. Which is often, the reason we don't see it is because the projection, the mechanism of projection, the positive and negative projection covers that up. And we don't see the other just being another that is going through whatever we are going through also, just, another experience arising in presence, right? So I first teach that kind of taking that little distance and looking at that projection and understanding that the other is just another, they are going through whatever we are going through, right? It's just another experience arising here, right? First of all. Secondly, I say, fulfillment or happiness or rest is not found out there. Right? We can't find it with the other. We can share it, but we can't find it with the other because it's an inner experience. Right? Mm-hmm. And when we come to relate, there's so many of these unfinished early experiences and early states that arise. And when that gets involved, I talk about conditioning, and there's the second kind of conditioning that arises in relating, and there's certain experiences or certain parts of our conditioning that are trying to get met by being with another. Mm. They are trying to get finished by being with another. So if anybody is in a relationship that has these so-called issues, right, where people can't get along, that's the unresolved past, right? That's your unresolved past, my unresolved past. That's what it is. And there's no resolving it out there, right? There's no meeting it out there. That the only way we can meet it is by meeting it in here. So that's why I say, I really recommend inquiry, right, for relating. Can you come back to rest? Can you come back to rest? Yeah, that's the beginning. There's, of course, many things I talk about when we talk about relating, but can we come back to rest?
Do you think that if a person didn't have unresolved issues, they wouldn't even bother getting into a relationship?
I don't know that that's true. You see, I'm not sure. Maybe, I'm not sure. Because there's part of our pull towards relating is unconscious. Unresolved past. Part of it is conscious, like, wow, that's great. I want to have that or be with that or be around that. So I don't know, maybe, I don't know. You know, who knows?
Are there people among your students who are taking your teaching to heart with regard to relationships, and you know, in order to recognize that the fault doesn't lie with the other, they're you know, it's their own tendencies that are bubbling up, but they're in a relationship where the partner isn't a student of yours and isn't thinking of it that way, and they're just going on doing what they do. And what do you say to such students?
No, here I would have to respond very, you know, practically to each particular person, because everybody is different, and I would have to know much more information before I can give an answer. Right?
Well, let's say you're working in a job and your boss is a jerk, and he really is a jerk, you know, and you know, you don't have control over the way he behaves, but you have control over the way you behave, and you can sort of
have control over if you remain in that job or not.
You do. You have that. And
so, you know, what I see inquiry really does for people, because it does different things for different people, right? Sometimes what it does is that whoever they are with begins to resonate with it, right? See, an interesting example, I had 1, 2, 3 students, women students over the last few years that have been in my longer programs. And I did a program on relationship a couple of months ago, and their husbands showed up, right? You know, because they were sharing some things with them, right?
They decided to join it, you mean?
Well, no, they came to another little program I was doing, because these women were in my long-term program. You can't just join it, you know, but they came to another little, I had a talk on the relationship, and they showed up, right?
Oh, good.
So the first thing is people can begin to resonate. They may have a different path. They may have a different way, but if they begin to resonate, they will start to like it. Start to like the changes. I remember a husband saying to me once, I wish you would keep my wife on the retreat, because every time she comes, this is so great, you know, when she comes after the retreat. Right? So they either begin to resonate, or they begin to really hate it, you see. And if the change is to something that they can't really resonate with, then that's going to drop out at some point, right?
Yeah.
Or it's going to create a transformation. You know, I have another example of a student, and she would come and say, I can't really resonate, or I can't really be with my family because they are, you know, they eat pizza and they watch television, and they, you know, when I go there, and she says, and I'm a vegetarian, and I'm, you know, doing yoga, and she said, what should I do? And I say, well, why don't you just go and hang out with them a little bit? And she said, I can't do that. And I said, well, just go and watch some television, you know, you don't have to eat the pizza, maybe get vegetarian, you know. And so she goes, and then some months later, she comes to me and she says, you know, I don't know what happened, she said, but my father so got into it that now he's reading Eckhart Tolle, and he's, you know, like he started like a book club or something, I don't know, you know, he's just so totally into it. And I'm just saying, well, it's a simple, you know, like there's the resonance, right? And if we trust in it, like with the job example, you know, I have another student in a program right now, and she just said, I have been in a really bad job for so many years. And since I have been doing this inquiry, something happened and I just quit the job. She said, I came so much into that congruence within myself and into the resonance, and I realized I was so codependent that I couldn't really do it before. But now that I know that here everything is okay, now I can just leave it and I can just go and do something else, right? So, you know, it's not like there's like one advice, you know what I mean? But when you do the work, when you do the inner work, the outer begins to respond, right?
Yeah. No, that's good. I mean, I understand how you couldn't give a specific advice, but that general principle, if you take care of it, there's a Bengali saying, if no one comes on your call, then go ahead alone. So, you know, if you do it, then one way or the other, the outer environment is going to change.
Exactly. Yeah. And I often, you know, I talk to people who have had addictions before, you know, and they know when they have changed from the addiction, like most of their life or most of their friends fall away, right?
Yeah.
But then they find a whole new life.
Oh, yeah. That happened to me. I mean, I was into drugs. I was hanging out with all my drug friends. I learned to meditate, and for about 3 months, I just walked the dog every day and you know, didn't hang out with anybody. And then a whole new social circle began to build.
Exactly. Beautiful. Yeah. It's just the way it works, right?
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Cool. So what else we got here? I'm just looking at the list. There's all kinds of interesting notes here. You are talking a lot more about the nervous system these days. We've sort of covered that, but I think it's important because obviously the nervous system is like, if consciousness is like lived through the nervous, it's similar to like, you need a television set to pick up on the signals that are in the air all the time anyway, but you don't pick them up without a television set, and the quality of your television set determines how clearly you pick them up. So like that, we have a nervous system, and you can finish the thought.
No, we have a nervous system, and what I say is that the more we understand this instrument, we live in the body, right? The more we understand and we understand how it works, the more helpful we can be to, the more helpful it is to being with our own experience, right?
Yeah.
So when we understand how does it work, and when we understand, when I teach about it, I talk about the brain, and I talk about the instinctual parts of the brain, and there's a lot of our experience that is not accessible by thinking, right? Which really is what proves what the spiritual teaching has been talking about forever. But physiologically, it's proven that the higher brain, as beautiful as it is, doesn't reach into the instinctual parts, right? So it can't regulate, stress. It can't regulate these instinctual states. They come on and they are, they are here, and no matter what you think, they are here, right?
Sure.
So we need to develop a different way, and that way is through the sensation, right? If we understand that that's how it works, then if we also understand how trauma past affects our ability to be present, right? If we understand trauma as not as an event that happened in the past, but if we understand trauma as a charge, an unresolved charge that is present in our nervous system, right? Then we see how that charge limits the capacity that we have in every moment to be with what is, right? So if we can understand that, if we can work with that, if we can have the tenderness and kindness and generosity of being here, like, well, can I just be here, Can I just be here with this, right? And understand that that's what's going to help. See, because when we talk about capacity, like, can I be with, like challenges in life? Challenges in life happen, capacity gets smaller and smaller and smaller within, right? And we say, well, I want to make a change, but we want to make a change out there, right? Rather than saying, well, I want to make a change, so let me be with this very small capacity. Let me be with this nervous system that is so struggling with whatever is going on in life, right? And from that being, something happens, capacity opens up. Now we can come and deal with what's happening, rather than just, I don't want this, I want it to change, I don't want it to be here. We can just, whoa, can I be here, right? So,
yeah.
So the more we understand, it and work it the way it needs to be worked, the more helpful it is for our ability to be here, right?
Reminds me of the first time I ever saw Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. He gave a lecture in which he started quoting Darwin. He was saying survival of the fittest is the law of nature. And I don't know if that's how Darwin meant it, but he said there's so much challenge these days. The pace of life is increasing so much. And, we have to increase our fitness to our capacity, basically, I think he was saying. In fact, he used an analogy. He says if a donkey has to carry a heavy load, you either have to lighten the load or strengthen the donkey. And he said, sometimes you can't lighten the load because there's so much coming at you in life. So you need to strengthen your capacity, increase your capacity. And then, what might have seemed like an overwhelming barrage of stuff becomes manageable.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And so I talk more about the nervous system, how it works, and also how to sit with it. Because we have this, we have learned, a lot of us come from some, like, what does it mean to be with something? It means like get totally overwhelmed and let it all just be here. And that's not necessarily how the nervous system works, right?
Yeah.
We have to learn like, well, just capacity and a little bit, how, regulate and all that. And once we get that, then it helps us so much with, practice, right? Inquiry.
Yeah. I'm sure you've heard the term neuroplasticity.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of that going on, I think, in what you're talking about.
Yeah, because the change, it used to be believed that there is no change in the brain after a certain time, right? And of course, in the spiritual teach realm, it was always true that, of course, the change happens whenever the consciousness, sets, right? Then that's change. It changes everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now it's like, well, by repeating certain actions, certain behaviors, certain, way of being, eventually it develops a different pathway in the brain too. That's brain plasticity, right? It's changeable, which is another way of saying, you can be free, right? It's possible. It's available to you this lifetime, right? It's possible.
And a lot of scientists are recognizing that too, like Rick Hansen and Rudy Tanzi, and various scientists are all writing about how dramatically the brain can actually change.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's a point that one of your helpers sent me, I think, Lee. She said, one point she'd like me to bring out in this, that the impact of doing a long-term program with you or with any other satsang-oriented teacher or teaching is an opportunity to deepen into presence in a way that is continuously more impactful than a satsang here and there. That long-term programs provide a safe container in which deep-rooted vasanas or patterns of conditioning can be seen, held, and fully let be here as they are, and witnessed by others in a non-judgmental way that can provide a path to really set these attachments free. So I guess I'm bringing that up as a sort of a moving toward a conclusion of the interview, that you offer these long-term programs, 6-month programs and whatnot, where you meet with people in fairly small groups in an intimate way, not physically in the same place, but over a conference call. And maybe you could speak a bit about what I just said, where the impact that you've seen in these long-term programs as opposed to attending a satsang here or a talk there.
And I also say in my own teaching, that has also changed over the years, right? Because there's different interests at different times. And so initially, my interest was just share it with anybody. Mm-hmm. Just go as bright, as wide as you can, and anywhere and everything, right? Uh-huh. That was the movement in the beginning, right? And then eventually there was more like developing of like, how can I really help people to be here? Because not everybody understands when you say, just be here. But what does it mean, right? How do you do it, right? And then eventually I recognized, my interest now is in that deeper work with people. It's not really anymore just bringing them back over and over and over to recognition of presence, right? Now the work is more like, hey, what stops you really, from fully resting here, right? Let's address that. And that is what the longer programs are about. And the initial 6-month program is really broader, because I have new students come into it, and it's a broader that really covers, more direct experience and more inquiry and how to do it and all that. But then after that initial 6-month program, and even in this, we go deeper into the tendencies. But after the initial 6-month program, I really spend time more individually with people. People write stuff, people, there's certain questions they answer, we interact, we do things in which I can be more of help to these particular tendencies that maybe are not visible to them, otherwise. And also the longer time, it's like, when we talk about brain plasticity or when we talk about practice, I'm not really satisfied anymore with somebody just visiting with me for a moment, I really want to see the change. And when I want to see the change, that takes time, you see. Mm-hmm. And so when we can do this over and over and over again for a certain period of time, that usually results in a more permanent change.
I remember hearing you say that you went through a phase where you would be walking down the street and you would actually see people's past lives and stuff like that. I mean, do you still have that, something like of that nature with your students, where you're kind of seeing much more deeply into their makeup or their nature than people ordinarily would see?
What I can say is, and this is the gift and the curse, of consciousness, right, of that recognition, is that, even walking on the street or looking at anybody, I can tell their history, I can tell the different things that they went through, I can tell what their conditioning is, and so on and on and on. I'm not going to speak more about it, but in a flash, it happens, and I can see that, all of it, right? Which sometimes I really work on protecting myself in a way from this information. And so you know, places I go, I don't like to talk about what I do, and I don't like to engage in that way. I try to really keep very much to, you know, like, let's not even, you know, engage on that level, right? Let me not even, that information comes to me anyway.
Yeah, there's a saying, you know, too much information.
Right, right, right. And it's not just too much, but it's just like, you know, that the significance of it, you know, that can be challenging, you know what I mean? Because it's not just information, it's very significant information, you know?
But it would seem that that would be a handy capability to have in working with students, to be able to see much more deeply into their...
When I sit with a student, that's where I reserve the time.
Yeah.
That, right? Because just being in a world that could be, you know, overwhelming, but sitting with the students, that's very helpful, because then I can see where they are at, right? I can
good.
It's really happening, and that's how I can be helpful, you know, more
Sure.
helpful. Right?
Yeah, so it's not something you really want to have going on in the grocery store, but when you're sitting with a student, yeah.
Exactly. And yet that information comes in anyway sometimes, and it's, you know, it's just how it is. So.
Yeah. So how many different programs do you have? You have this 6-month thing, and then...
You know, because of the limits of my health, I only do usually 2 6-month programs throughout the winter and fall and winter.
And they're identical, so you do one and then another?
One is for new students, and one is for the students that have done programs before.
I see. So the first one's like a prerequisite to the second one.
Well, in a way, yes, because people learn inquiry. Mm-hmm. And then throughout the summer, I do smaller programs, and also a program, like a 5-week program, where I teach inquiry too. Mm-hmm. You know, so, you know, there's this other, I do some open calls and some other different little things, you know.
Okay.
And shorter programs in the summer too.
Yeah, people are busy with things in the summer.
Exactly.
Yeah. Good. Well, it sounds like you have a whole lot of... If a person, having listened to this interview, feels inspired to plug into it somehow, there's all kinds of things they can do.
Yes, of course. They can come to our website, and they can look at our schedule, and they can see this variety of ways to come and visit and see if that's something that they would like to.
Yeah. And as I mentioned in the first interview, I have some friends that I've known for decades that are students of yours, and have really consistently been engaged with you. Well, that reminds me of one more question, which is that what kind of changes have you seen in people who have worked with you for a long time?
You know, the one thing is, unfortunately, sometimes you say, you know, unfortunately, you when people go through the good changes, you don't see them anymore, right? Because they just, you know, they don't need to do it anymore, right? But the changes that I see really in long-term students is the capacity to be here. Mm-hmm. The capacity to be here, and really what they can be within their own experience. And also what I see, which is really amazing, you know, I have seen this over and over and over and over again, and I see this in many of the students that you probably know, you know, that the changes are in how does that translate into their life?
Yeah.
How does that capacity show up in the way they are actually functional in life? Mm-hmm. So that's where I see the biggest change, really, you know, real time change, right?
Well, that would really be the acid test, I should think, you know?
Exactly.
And do you ever have some students who say, sorry, Neelam, I'm just not getting it, you know? I mean, maybe I should move on.
Well, you know, they probably did move on.
They just moved on anyway.
I think that I have that conversation, but that I don't think that ever happened, you know? I don't think that, maybe there was one time that a person came into a program, and she said, she was with another teacher before, and the teacher speaks in a different way. And she came into the program, and she says, I just don't understand how you're saying it. And I said, well, you know, you just relax, and then you will. But she decided to just move on, and that's, you know, that's just, you know, what to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, come who comes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. Is there anything else that you feel like saying before we conclude? No,
I think that's good, you know. I think that's, we have done it all. And maybe one thing I always want to say is, you know, we want to know freedom is really available to us, you know. That is our natural state, and we can know it in this lifetime, you know, and that's what I would like everybody to remember, that's really true, that we can, and it's possible. Yeah, I think I'm glad you said that, and even more so these days than
might have been true 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It seems like it's more in the air these days.
See, things are speeding up on the planet, so there's really like, okay, you know, what else to do? You know, you can still go and do the nonsense that you're doing, or you can just really go like, whoa, wait a minute, this is really true. I can actually be here. You know.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think we've given people a nice overview, and I think we managed to cover a lot of things that we didn't talk about too much in the first interview. So it's worth listening to both, I'd say.
Beautiful. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So let me make some concluding remarks. First of all, thanks again, Neelam. It was wonderful talking with you. I really enjoy it, and I know you had to do a lot of running around, and we sent you equipment, and had to all kinds of stuff we try to do to make.
No worries.
So that was great. I appreciate you doing all that. And I just want to make a few general comments. So, well, first of all, as we've already said during the interview, if you want to get in touch with Neelam, you just go to her website, which is neelam.org, and I'll have a link to that on batgap.com, and there will be a page for this interview in particular. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube or something, you can go to batgap.com. You'll see that page with a lot more information and links to Neelam's website. And you will also see all the other interviews I've done, well over 200 now. There are several different indices. There's an alphabetical index, a chronological index, a bunch of other things if you play around with the menus on the website. You'll also see a link to an audio podcast so that you can subscribe on iTunes and just listen to the audio. There's a donate button, which I appreciate people clicking if they feel inspired. There's a place to sign up to be notified by email each time a new interview is posted. And so you'll get about 1 email a week as a result of signing up there. And there's a discussion group that crops up around each interview, a forum. And there'll be, there's a different section of the forum for each interview. So you can go in and discuss some of the things we've talked about in this interview if you like. So thanks for listening or watching. And thanks again, Neelam. And,
thank you so much, Rick. It's so nice. Such a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, it was great.
I appreciate you and all the work that you put into it. It's just so awesome. I really, really appreciate that. So.
Well, it's a lot of fun, and I have some wonderful helpers. My wife, who's sitting here, who does hours a day worth of stuff, and my friend from high school, Ralph Preston, who does all the video post-production, Larry Kelly up in Canada, who does the audio post-production, a guy named Jerry in Utah who coordinates the sending of the equipment and testing things with people. There's a team of translators and transcribers headed up by a guy named Nicholas who's in Spain. And so there's a lot of people who've stepped forward to volunteer, which is another thing you'll find on the website, is a page of potential volunteer activities if you'd like to take a look at that, and maybe there'll be something that resonates with your skills. So good. So we'll see.
And I also enjoy you personally listening to hours and hours and hours before the interview. That is so awesome and deeply appreciated. So
well, I really enjoy it. It's very listenable. It's good stuff. All right, thanks, Neelam.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.